First step in seeking investors is actually a decision by the entrepreneur that they would like to have other owners in their company, because an investor, as opposed to a lender, is an owner. So they're going to be a partner, and an owner would like a long-term relationship, typically with the company, and would like information about the current and future state of that company. So it really comes down to a decision that is the entrepreneur open to having those types of relationships. Once you reach that point, then you kind of need to think about it as a bit of a process as opposed to just an event. And so strategically think about what your objectives are in the short, medium, and long term, what your needs are, and then begin a search of the multitude of investors that are out there. But I take it back to a decision that you really would like to take on a partnership, owner type long-term relationship with specific individuals or institutions that are aligned around your goals and objectives. In the early stages of a company, whether you're a technology-based ICT company or maybe plans for some sort of manufacturing facility in which you have large assets and buildings, equipment, those things, typically that early stage is called seed financing. And in the seed financing stage, you will be referencing and leaning on friends, families, very key suppliers who may be willing to give you smaller amounts of money to help you reach various milestones, which may be as simple as writing a business plan, securing a lease on a piece of equipment, opening up doors, making 2 trips to a marketing show to understand, is this worth it? So that's in your early stages. You'll go on the seed. Then you may, even in this early stage, you might move then to a thing called development type financing. And in the developmental type financing, you would be leaning on, again, probably some of those same folks and institutions that were involved in your seed financing. And then other groups that typically come to play are government organizations, have various economic development programs. You would lean on suppliers, key suppliers would start to show up, and maybe other partnerships that are out there. That will be very similar to both. As you move to the later stages of development, and between those two, there's a big gap, there's a big hurdle to get over, and often a long period of time. As you move to the later stages of, let's say, a company that's up and running, and maybe we're in growth mode as opposed to startup mode, you would then look to the banks. Traditional bank financing may come to play. Equity funds, known as private equity, and typically that could be venture capital type financing or private equity funds, depending on the type of your company. It's a pretty big decision to consider with respect to equity or investors, owners. It's a big decision to bring those owners on board. So I think you really need to focus on what your individual goals and objectives are for your company, and try to align those with those investors that you're bringing on board. There are a lot of investors available in the marketplace, but like all things, they may not align with your objectives, and gaining that alignment is very important. When it comes to debt financing, which is more of a short-term perspective, it's important to understand that debt financing, the most important consideration for those types of institutions and individuals, the question becomes, will you be able to pay back my money? So they really focus on the historical view of the company and the ability of the company to generate cash flows that can pay back my debt. If they don't see that availability, then debt lenders are typically not going to participate in your company. Investors, and just a reminder that investors are owners with long-term views of the company. They have specific objectives. Often that is known as a rate of return. So they would put their, let's say, $10,000 to $100,000 into the company today, and their expectation is that at some point in the future, an event will occur that will generate for them, I'll call a significant return. So that return may be 15 to 20% per annum. Again, that's a big differentiator from a lender. So given that, your proposal to the investor should be customized as much as possible. In order to customize your proposal, it's very important to research as much as you can ahead of time. So the advent of the internet, various organizations, economic development agencies, personal contacts will help you understand before you meet with that investor what are the objectives and goals for that investor. If those are aligned with yours, then I believe you're in a position to approach that investor. If, however, they are diametrically opposed, so for example, you learn that the investor is very interested in real estate development and you're going to show up with the next nanotechnology, I'm not sure that there's alignment. So by being prepared and having researched those folks, you can save yourself a lot of time, and more importantly, not put too undue waste the time of that investor. The art of valuation, there's a science to valuation, and so the scientific part can be picked up in many textbooks. Often we'll use Deloitte in particular. We use a method. We'll try to triangulate in terms of, we will look at 3 different methods of valuing a company, scientific methods, and that will then create some sort of range of the potential outcomes, and within that range may be what we deem to be an appropriate valuation. However, evaluation is all done, and so to roll that back, the 3 valuation methodologies are typically a discounted cash flow, which is a 10 to 15 year forecast, quite relevant for established companies with positive cash flows, not as relevant, let's say, to an early stage startup company. We would have another method where you look to the public equity markets and look for either the stock price of that company, of various comparable companies over a period of time, gather a group of those individual companies, put them together, determine that they are a relevant comparable group, and say, okay, based on their valuation in the public markets, then our private company may be worth some factor of that. In that method, it's very important to consider that there's typically a discount between the prices paid for public companies versus private companies. And again, these are sort of industry type norms that move a little bit in terms of range. The reason being, one of the simple ways to look at it is public company shares can be freely traded, on a public market. Information is subject to disclosure, so it's a broad-based open market. Private companies, there is not that market to sell the shares to other people, so that's one of the reasons you'll have a discount, and there are others as well. The third method may be to look at what's called a comparable transactions, and in the transaction may be various companies are bought and sold again on the public equity markets. So gather together a group of companies that may be similar to yours, or you deem to be similar to yours, and maybe you've had some objective help to determine that, and again, sort of back your way into what maybe your company may be worth. Important when you think of evaluation to think of a range, because picking one specific number at a specific point in time based on a past experience is inherently wrong, because time has passed since you set the number. So the number is constantly moving, not minute by minute, but month by month or year by year, there is a change in that valuation. So thinking of it of a range of acceptable numbers is important. With startup companies, if you went into the technology sector, there's again some rules of thumb or some science to it. You may look at one way I've seen software companies evaluated maybe the cost of building that equivalent software, or maybe it's the cost I've spent in developing that software to date. What are the alternatives out there? So there's quite a bit of art. Valuation is often an important part of the discussion between an investor and an entrepreneur, because it forms the basis on which shares are sold and how much of the company you give up. Again, I think when you think of approaching investors who are of like mind, their objectives and goals are aligned with yours, you can typically work your way through the valuation, but I think you need to be prepared to think of it as a range, and it is fluid, and it is from a different perspective. So 3 people could sit down, or 2 people in particular could definitely sit down with the same set of data, same information, and come up with differing valuations based on their perspective. And their perspectives may be expectations for return. The owner who's selling may say, okay, I think a 10% rate of return is okay, whereas the investors say, no, I need to make 20. So there's many things to go into the valuation.